Thank you all for joining us today for the fourth webinar in our series for Legacy Cannabis Genetics, People and Their Plants, a Community-Driven Study. My name is Janine Coleman, and I am the Executive Director of Origins Council and one of the co-principal investigators on the study. Very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Todd Holmes, historian with the UC Berkeley Oral History Center and fellow co-principal investigator on the study. I just wanted to open by saying we're gonna try and stay on mute during the presentation, and then once Todd's concluded, we'll open up for Q&A. We are recording and we'll be posting the recording to our website, legacycannabis.org, so folks can check out the recording there and also sign up for our next webinar in the series, which will be on January 17th, and that will be a presentation by Dr. Eleanor Kuntz, another co-principal investigator on the study, and her team at LeafWorks around herbarium science and genetic study component of the research. And so with that, I'm happy to pass it to you, Todd.
Right, let me share my screen. Does that show up for everyone?
Yes, I see it.
Yes, not in a weird way.
No.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. And first of all, let me apologize. I've been fighting a cold off all week, so if I'm a little slower than usual, my apologies. But what I'd also like to say is, wow, like thanks for everyone for coming. I mean, usually any kind of academic talk, let alone a history talk on a Friday, is always an iffy proposition. And so let alone on the Friday before many of us kind of like unplug and like slowly dip into the holiday haze for the next 2 weeks. So I appreciate everyone being here. My name is Todd Holmes, and I am, as Janine mentioned, I'm the co-PI handling the oral history portion of the project, which we'll be talking about today. Just a little brief intro about me and the center. So the Oral History Center at the Bancroft Library was founded in 1953. And so projects like this is actually what we do full time. So we don't teach, we don't grade papers or really deal much with students. We just run oral history projects. And we do so around the nation, but particularly here in California. So I'm like one of 5 historians that make up the center staff, along with our production staff and others. And we do probably collectively about 500 hours of interviews each year. So again, we're pretty busy, and this is kind of like our bailiwick, if you will, kind of what we do. As a historian, I specialize in the history of California and the West. And so usually how I went, the only time I haven't been in California is actually the 6 years of grad school I did on the East Coast. So I'm a lifelong Californian, and I was fortunate enough after graduate school to come back, and I've been here largely ever since. I specialize over the last 20 years in studying California politics. And so you wonder, like, well, how'd you go from politics and dealing with like Ronald Reagan to dealing with California cannabis? And it largely kind of follows such as this. As I've said before, is usually you can study politics for so long that you're going to end up having to study California business. And when you study California business, you're going to end up having to study California agriculture, which I'll touch on a little bit today. And once you're in the realm of California agriculture, it's usually just a hop, skip, and a stumble before you're wandering around California cannabis. And so that's many of us who study California have long used to like wonder, like, man, how can we really document the history of cannabis, particularly in the Golden State, because it's so important. And so when Prop 64 passed in 2016, like the day after that election, I'm sitting in my office at Berkeley as protests are going on like around around campus. And I began to brainstorm. I was like, wow, this really opened the door, the opportunity for our cannabis communities to kind of come out of the shadows. And we could really in a real way begin to document that. And I knew oral history was going to be an important part in that. And so over the years, I finally got in touch with a guy named Joe Hoover in the 420 Archive based out of Minnesota. And it was through Joe that I was gratefully introduced to Janine Coleman and other wonderful affiliates of Origins Council. And so a lot of that brainstorming over the years, we started figuring out ways we could do this. And then in 2022, DCC put out this research proposal. And that's really was the start of our project, Legacy Cannabis Genetics, People and Their Plants, a community-driven study. And on this front, I really want to say there's a big kudos to Janine on this front, because it was through Origins Council that she really like herded a bunch of cats to get all of us together, right? And that's really no easy feat. I mean, you want to get a historian, a scientist, and a political geographer and community representatives in the same boat and try to facilitate us to all row in the same direction, right? That's a really, really tough job to do. And so I'm really grateful to be part of this team. And so we came together and joined forces, as if you will, and put together a proposal that in 2023 was approved. And so we got $2.7 million to pursue this study. I really like this, and I'm borrowing some of this. I think Janine put together this one because I think it's really important, because there's so much about, we're talking about legacy genetics. Really, what does that mean, right? And so legacy really refers to the traditional cannabis cultivation practices, regions, and communities, right? And when we talk about genetics, that's also the inherent traits and characteristics of the cannabis plants themselves, which are largely determined by their DNA, right? So, I mean, there's many cultivators probably in this group who know way much more about this than I do, right? And so why do we care when we put this together? Like in a sense, why does the DCC care, right? I think there's a lot of reasons that all of us could put on the table to discuss, but the principal one, particularly of the research team, is to preserve the historic cannabis cultivation and the communities of California and their genetic resources, and to find ways that could ensure the continued biodiversity and innovation of California cannabis. And so that's in a sense of, one of the principal goals, I think, and that underlies much of our research and our work collectively as a team. So quickly, I should focus on the regions that our research is focusing on. And so this is really one of the first studies that's trying to combine both rural as well as our urban growers. And so the rural regions that we're focusing on, and that even the oral histories will be focusing on, are of course the Emerald Triangle, right? So Humboldt, Mendocino, and Trinity counties, as well as Sonoma and Nevada counties. And then our friends there on the Central Coast, right? Santa Cruz, Monterey, and San Luis Obispo counties. But we're also going to look at urban regions, right? And so we're going to be looking at what I like to call the I-80 corridor. So that's stretching from, going from San Francisco through Oakland, Richmond, and up to Sacramento. And then down south, the I-5 corridor. So including Long Beach, Los Angeles, and San Diego. And so these are the regions, both the rural and the urban, that our research and our team will be engaging with. And so, like many, we look at this and say, first of all, like 2 cheers for like Google diagrams, right? I mean, this is the first time that I think I've ever been able to have a visualization of what our project actually looks like. And fittingly, our community-based participatory research, which is the methodology and the basis of our project, really sits at the core of this. And this is the essence of this, is that the community is a partner, not a subject in this research. And so meaning we have community representatives on the research team. We have, as discussed in our last webinar, and I'll touch on a little bit today, a community advisory board we're going to be putting together. But there's also a number of different ways that the community is going to be able to be involved and participate in the research and have a voice in that. And then our 4 research tracks, right? So if you wanted to take this in broad strokes, really what this is that the history part of cannabis is going to be, we're going to approaching that in 2 ways. Dominic Corva, whose webinar was 2 webinars ago, will be doing a political geography of California cannabis using ethnographic interviews. I'm going to be really on the ground documenting in-depthly of the community's history through oral history, and making those documents also available when they're done. And then that history is going to be put into conversation with science, which is also, again, very rare when we look at these kind of research projects. And so Eleanor Kuntz and her team at LeafWorks and Candor are going to be handling that. And then so together, collectively, we're hoping this is going to be a foundation in many different ways of a historical and scientific foundation of California communities and the genetics they steward. And then so, how are these communities supposed to maybe harness these genetic resources and benefit from that? And that's where Janine Coleman and the research team at Origins Council will also be looking at what tools are available in the realm of intellectual property rights. And then also making policy recommendations of what tools could be added to that toolbox to help out our cannabis communities. So kind of like in a nutshell, if you will, this is kind of our research project, kind of how it's formed. And again, I would say the CVPR and the ethnography, political geography webinars, if you missed those, the recordings are on the website. For the herbarium science and intellectual property webinars, those will be coming in January after we get back from the holidays. And as for oral history, well, buckle in because that's what we're covering today. So what is oral history? Oral history is, by definition, the documentation of memories and personal commentaries of historical significance through recorded interviews. Now, this is a practice that historians began to use probably about 70 to 80 years ago, but even goes back further than that, in a sense to diversify the archive and document the experience of those, particularly communities, that were excluded. So if we think about how history is written, how do we know what happened in the past? Right, it's written through the archive. So history nerds such as myself would sit in an archive and we go through all sorts of research and material and stuff, and we put that together, and then we write a history of something. Well, if you think about, like, what about the communities whose experiences were left out? And like, for an example, communities of color. If you looked at a history textbook of America and the American experience in 1950 and compare that today, you would see much more diversity in that American experience, many more different groups and communities that would be included. And that was largely thanks to oral history. So we think of other subgroups such as ethnic studies, right? So African-American studies, Chicano studies, the very basis and methodology used to study those communities and those fields is oral history. That was a way they were able to recover the history of their communities and such. And so that's so recovery was one part of that. It's also used to supplement the archive. So if you ever go to a presidential library, right, oral histories are done to supplement the reams and reams and reams of material of a presidential administration, right? And that gives you the backstory of certain legislation. So in this project, oral history is going to be used to conduct about 100 hours of cannabis oral histories, and it's going to be in that recovery mode, right? So we're really trying to document the history of California cannabis communities and create a historical foundation of both the craft and the genetic heritage. So really quickly, why would a historian of California find this important, right? And so I just wanted, because we talk a little about legacy and we talk about heritage, so I just wanted to make a quick note on that. And mostly is to put kind of some things in context, right? Now, I promise you, I'm not going to give you a history lecture here on a Friday. I promise you, right? But I just actually wanted to highlight something that I think is fairly quickly on this front. The graph to your right is actually is something that represents the California economy, right? And so this has largely been unchanged for about 125 years. And is that agriculture is actually the hub of the state economy. It's right. It's the #1 industry. And this is usually something that's often overlooked. When we think of Silicon Valley, we think of Hollywood, right? But actually, California is like, agriculture is not only the #1 industry in California and has been for well over a century, but ever since like the early 1960s, actually California is the #1 agricultural state. And that's because we produce about over 400 agricultural commodities. So fruits and nuts and vegetables that we dominate most of the national market, and we ship all around the world. And this probably, I think we're on track it's an industry that brings in about $60 billion in cash receipts. Now, when we think about agriculture, we usually think about the Corn Belt, or we think about the wheat belt in the Midwest. And what makes California different are these type of specialty crops that we grow that nobody else really can. And the reason that is because of our environment. So first of all, we have a Mediterranean climate, right? Only 2% of the world actually has that climate. And what those other places that have that climate don't have are the dozens upon dozens of fertile valleys that we have throughout the state, particularly the long Central Valley that stretches about 450 miles, from Redding to Bakersfield. And then we have a bunch of foothills and river valleys, both in the north and in the south. And these all then are encompassed by countless microclimates. For many growers there on the coast, you actually know exactly what microclimates are, right? There's probably about 30 in San Luis Obispo on themselves, and there's also in the inland valleys. And so these microclimates are then also irrigated by probably arguably one of the most manipulated waterscapes in the world. California has probably right around 1,300 dams and reservoirs that are then used hundreds and hundreds of miles of irrigation canals. And so we ship water all over the state, but principally from from north to south. And so when we think about agriculture, many states may have agriculture. This is why it's usually joked, well, California has agribusiness. And that agribusiness allows us to do many of these specialty crops. These are staples when you go to the grocery store. Most of these, California produces anywhere from 70 to 90% of them, and in some cases, all of them. This climate was actually so conducive that the state throughout its history would actually have like a number of initiatives of like, what can't you grow in California? I mean, we grow cotton and we grow rice and we grow fruits and nuts and vegetables, that we ship around the world and dominate the national market. And there's also crazy stories. I mean, we tried to grow like, rubber trees here in California at one point, and like bananas and things like that. So the point is actually, it's also this, like among these specialty crops, the climate was so conducive that we had eugenicists like Luther Burbank who would actually create his own crops. This is where the pluoc came from, right? Or the plumquat and a variety of other flowers. So they were able to create their own. But by the late 1980s, in the list of these specialty crops, it actually became known by both state departments and other, agricultural reps that actually the #1 specialty crop in California was cannabis. It outstripped every other specialty crops such as grapes, or strawberries and everything else that became the staple in grocery stores. So in many ways, when we speak about legacy and we speak about heritage, cannabis actually fits squarely within the legacy and culture of California agriculture, right? Cultivators following a well-trodden path of bringing in plants from all around the world into California, where they were nurtured and bred to perfection in the various microclimates of the state's environment to produce a quality and quantity that was uniquely Californian. And so this is one of the aspects of many that gets me really excited actually about this project, is really to begin to put California cannabis into the historical record, to recognize these communities, and more importantly, I would even say to celebrate these communities. The innovations of California agriculture, which are world-renowned, those were brought forth by university research and millions upon millions of dollars of state and federal funding. The innovations of what we would see in California cannabis was actually honed and developed in the shadows of Prohibition and passed down from one generation to the next. And so how do we start documenting this? Well, oral history is going to be one of the main ways. So when we talk about the selection process for oral history, when we talk about the selection process for oral history in this project, I'm really happy to report two things. First of all, contrary to the graphic, there will be no big hands taking anyone anywhere. Secondly, much more knowledgeable people than Todd Holmes are going to actually be weighing in on this. And this, in fact, is where our CPR methodology actually comes into play. It's also something that in many of my oral history projects that I also use as well. And that's really working hand in hand with the community. Here, as in other kind of projects, I mean, the communities are the experts. They're the ones who know who should be interviewed. And so this is the community is going to have a voice in this process largely in two ways. First of all, we're going to have nomination forms, and those will be posted on our website in early January, where we're going to reach out to the communities and have the community members themselves nominate both themselves as well as others in the community who they think should be participating in the oral histories, who they believe that you should, would be warranted, and who they would want to see an oral history with. Those nominations are then going to be anonymized right? So we're just going to be using really the data, not the person's name, but the data of that person. And the selection process will then be brought to the Community Advisory Board, which we talked about in our last webinar. And we're going to be coordinating the research team with the Community Advisory Board on that selection process. And again, all of this will be transparent. Transparency is very key in this project. So a lot of this process, as well as all the other information of who's going to be on the advisory board, et cetera, will be on our website. And that's in the sense of how we're going to select the interviewees for the oral history. Once I get that list in each region, I'm going to set up meetings. And so we're going to have a number of meetings with the interviewees, and their voice is going to be key to this entire process. So the difference when we think about oral history is actually a partnership. It's not just me showing up and hitting record. It's much different than, say, a journalist interview, broadly speaking. This is a partnership, and so the interviewee is going to have a strong hand and a voice in how that interview is going to go, from what is discussed to what is actually made public. So we're going to have a number of meetings before we ever show up to record their oral history. And that's a way that we can get to know each other, build trust. But in those discussions, we're going to be able to identify the areas that should be discussed and included in the oral history. It's also going to give us a chance to highlight areas not to be discussed. And so there's a lot of examples I could give of this, of interviewees that in oral histories I've conducted who went to federal prison, or that their career ended due to a scandal. And so we were able to discuss ways of like, hey, how do you want to handle this in the interview? We can skip it, or whatever. And so a lot of this is ways that, and again, working together to craft how that interview, what's going to be on the table and what's off the table. And I take a lot from those meetings, then I take those data points for my own research. And I go off and do those research, and then I create session outlines for each interview. And these are largely roadmaps. They're not scripts, but they're like roadmaps for those interviews. And I send those to actually the interviewee, and that allows them to review what we discussed, review the areas of discussion and the shape of the interview, and they're able to edit however they see fit, and then approve those outlines. And so just some examples of the areas of discussion of what I would want to cover, generally speaking, in an oral history for cannabis. I want to talk about their first interaction with cannabis, their personal and maybe family history, community history, talk a little bit about cannabis culture in their community, perhaps also in their family. Obviously, we're going to talk about their cultivation and breeding experience, as well as those practices and the cultivars that they worked with over their career. And then also, obviously, as history is change over time, we really want to kind of, like, in the breadth of the interview, talk a little bit about how the cultivars and practices evolved over time, as well as how maybe the cannabis community as well as cannabis culture changed during that time as well. And if we think about it, we're looking at the three distinct periods of prohibition, medical, and legalization. And so in broad strokes, those are kind of like that narrative arc of what we're looking at in the oral histories. The interviews themselves usually last about 2 hours, and that's usually how I make the session. And in each session, depending on the person and depending on how much experience they have, their place within the community, we'll do 1 to 2 sessions. Again, when we show up for these interviews, we have an outline, we have a roadmap, and we've already built some trust. And so if it's not on the outline, it's not going to be discussed. And I think that's really crucial in the oral history process, because it's my main goal in these is I want to capture that interviewee and their story at their best. And so for that to happen, people need to be comfortable. They have to, have built trust with the person asking the questions. They have to know, like, where's this going to go, right? So they have a roadmap, so they can feel confident in, this is what we're covering today in this interview session. So there's no surprises. There's no gotcha questions. In regards to location for the interview, I really leave that up to the interviewee, like particularly their choice and comfort. We do a mixture of in-person interviews as well as via Zoom. And I'd like also to video record most of our oral histories. A lot of this is video allows different options for it to be used, and I'll touch a little bit on that later here in this talk. But it also, as a historical resource, there's something that's different about reading what somebody says, even hearing what somebody says, but putting those together and actually seeing how they said it for historical preservation, I think is really important. So we always video record. However, if someone really chooses not for whatever reason to be video recorded, that's completely up to them, and we can just do audio only. When I interviewed Jerry Brown for 40 hours, he refused to be video recorded, mostly because I think he had some surgery on his nose, and so it was all audio. So totally doable, and we do that all the time. When we are done with the interview, each interview is going to be transcribed. And we're going to actually do these ones, the interviews for this project in-house at the Oral History Center. We typically send our interviews out for transcription to a professional transcription service. For these, though, due to perhaps some of the sensitive nature of them, we've decided that we're going to do them all in-house. And I'm going to oversee that entire process. When the interview is transcribed, and this is one of the other points of where, like, again, dovetailing with the CBPR methodology, where interviewees have that voice in the hand of what actually goes public. There's a review process, and so this is another safeguard of, as I've encountered many of times in interviews, where people are speaking freely, and then they have afterwards like, man, I'm not sure if I should have really told that story. Well, this is another safeguard that you're going to have full access to maybe take that story out if you choose. So the review process starts, first of all, with me. So I'm going to oversee that not only the whole transcription, but then I'm going to review that transcript. I'm going to make slight edits for clarity. I'm going to make some edits, for transcription errors. And then I'm going to flag some names and even statements sometimes that I just want to bring to the interviewee's attention. It's then given to them, and they can edit this however they see fit. They can flag areas for concern, etc. So in a sense, you get to review exactly what's going to go public, and you get to actually approve that and have a hand in what it actually says. For larger things, when we tell stories that we have second thoughts about, well, we have a redaction process. And that actually means that the audio, the video, as well as the transcript, we can take things out. And they're all going to be edited accordingly, so they're going to match at the end to what actually goes public. And so, again, there's that safeguard of you don't have to worry during the interview. You can really feel free to speak freely because you're going to have a chance to take a second look at that when that time comes around and decide actually what goes public. We also have a seals policy, and it's one of the benefits of the Bancroft Library. In a sense, 75 years from now, it may not be called the Bancroft Library at that point, but it will still be there. I'll be long gone. And but you'll have somebody who's actually going to be tracking that. So you can seal portions as well as the entire interview if you so choose. And that, that's very rare in our case, but it has happened at times. And you can put a time limit on that. And when that time limit is up, it's in the computer system, in the database there at UC Berkeley, that it will pop up. And so then the rest of that will be released. And so there's all sorts of options when it comes to what is going to be made public with your transcript as well as the audio video. And so again, only the approved transcript will be made publicly available, and the video recordings will be edited for seals and redactions if needed. So again, the interviewee, as that type of partnership in oral history, will have a hand in how this moves forward. It's going to be then archived at the Bancroft Library in its holdings. So a hard copy of that transcript will be available on site in the research room. A digital version will be made available online through our online archive, and both will be fully available to the public. The video recordings will be preserved in the collection, and as of now, they will not be made publicly available, but only on request. And again, if for whatever reason you would rather not have your video ever online or on request, you can also, again, that's within our provisions that you can decide that. Legal release. And so why a copyright? And when we talk about copyrights, most people think like, oh, well, you're trying to sell these. And it's actually no. All the oral histories conducted by UC Berkeley are deemed educational resources. and they're made available to researchers and the public at no cost. So a copyright actually protects the zero paywall and the free public access to start. It also protects the interviewee's words, meaning that someone can't use those words without a proper citation, right? As well as not just a proper reference, but at times proper permission. And so there's three options when we look at the copyright for the oral histories. The copyright can be held by the UC Regents. They can also be a shared copyright between the UC Regents and the interviewee, or it could be held specifically with the interviewee, granting UC Berkeley the rights to host and make publicly available the recordings and or the transcripts. And in all three of these options, the interviewees will always keep the rights to their own words, and can use them however they wish. So the matter of like, well, how do you choose which option? You know, that a lot of people have different opinions on that. The main matter outside is of a copyright is for use requests. So if somebody wants to use the video, if somebody wants to use portions and cite portions of the transcripts, right, in a research or whatever project they're using that goes beyond the limits, then they have to ask for permission. And so if UC holds the copyright, they're able by the agreed upon portions that they've agreed with you, the interviewee, they'll make the decisions on that. Otherwise, they'll have to be shipped to you. And so the other point of who owns the copyright is also policing the copyright violations. So that's like, for example, selling the oral history on Amazon, which you would be surprised happens quite often, more than you would think, right? Something free, then somebody wants to, you know, package it and then try to resell it. And so UC Berkeley is pretty vigilant on not just being able to flag those and be able to identify them, but also usually with the clout to say you're going to have to take those down right now. So they have a whole department that handles that. But again, those three options are completely up to you, and any other additional provisions that you would need. Last note on image rights. The interviewee, as this is video recorded, always maintains image rights. You know, so that's never part of the copyright of the actual transcript. The image rights always stays with the interviewee. So if we thought about the contributions, first of all, these collectively, these oral histories are going to come together and create the California Cannabis Oral History Collection at UC Berkeley. And this is really going to be a collection that's going to be a first of its kind. And what I hope will begin to place California cannabis into the historical record. It's a history that's actually told by the community members themselves, which I'll touch on again in a minute, but it's also something we can preserve for the future generations, and a collection that is hope that will build a historical foundation for the community, for policymakers, for scholars and journalists, as well as the public. In thinking of history told by the community members, you know, mansplaining is a thing, but I think scholar-splaining is a similar thing that can prove equally offensive. Having somebody else interpret and tell your story in ways you would not. And so this is another aspect of oral history that I find so powerful, that in some respects, right, it's really one of the truest forms of historical documentation, of, you know, creating a primary source is what we would call it, through the recollections and observations of someone as told in their own words. And so one of my very first cannabis oral histories was with Oliver Bates, a dear friend of mine, but also the president of the Big Sur Farmers Alliance. And this is now available online. And I think it's a great example of what we're trying to capture in these oral histories, that mix of both community history and personal history with a large dose of, you know, genetic discussion. And again, something that we hope that will be kind of a model of some of the things that we want to do in this project. But I would also say that it actually also served as the basis for this short piece that the project and us, we showed at the California State Fair Cannabis Exhibit in 2023, which is now available also on YouTube. And again, I illustrate this as a powerful example of a short history of a community that's actually told by one of its members. It's not told by an outsider or a narrator. It was actually all in the words that were used was by one of its members who did the due diligence of talking with elders and also their personal experience to bring together to tell, to begin to tell the story of their community. And I think that's it's in many ways is what I think the California cannabis communities deserve. And I hope it's the oral histories conducted in this project can begin to create that foundation for similar projects such as this to happen. The other contribution is, again, bringing all the research scopes together. And again, this type of collaborative study, I'm going to say, is really the first of its kind. To combine oral history with political geography through ethnographic interviews, along with science of the herbarium and the genetics, right? This collectively really creates a very strong foundation of not just the history of the communities, but also the history, movement, and verification of the cannabis genetics themselves. And we're hoping that, again, this collectively will create just a really good foundational resource and foundation for intellectual property claims for the communities themselves to begin to harness those genetic resources. I hear really quickly just put the example of California wine. So in one of the places when we look at appellations, right, Napa Valley is one of those. And one of the resources the Napa Valley Ventures was able to use were the oral histories from UC Berkeley that stemmed back to the 1960s. Now, again, that was just one component of many within, that work. And again, Richard Mendelsohn and others could speak much more authoritatively on that. But they were able to harness a lot of other kind of scientific stuff, scientific stuff. There's a Friday word for you. Scientific research and other research. But again, that was already there from the state, right? So this is where I think by looking at that as an example is, again, what the three pieces all put together in this project is trying to build that type of foundation for the communities moving forward to harness not just harness those genetic resources and heritage. So lastly, as Janine mentioned, before I take off, we're going to have further webinars in January. Again, Eleanor Kuntz from LeafWorks in Canada will be here on January 17th, talking about herbarium science and plant genetics. And then to round out and end our webinar series on the 31st, intellectual property and public policy will be discussed by Janine Coleman and other researchers from the Origins Council team. So with that, I thank you all. We'll take time for questions and happy holidays. I guess I could probably stop sharing my screen now, right?
I have a quick question, if that could be allowed.
Yeah, yes, I do. I'm just trying to figure out how do I end sharing, but I'm not sure.
I was wondering, as somebody that's worked in all of the markets of the three arches that you have dubbed was prohibition, medical, and now recreational medical, I was wondering, how do we equate as we document how we've evolved as farmers to become business owners, to become content creators, to become all these things that we now have to do in this world? How do we document how the genetics have not just mutated and adapted into these microclimates, but how the industry and marketing has adapted in order to create the hype that still fuels what is seen as the traditional or black market? Because we have this ancillary thing where we really wouldn't have become this popular and this well-known in cannabis had we not had an outlet. That we didn't get put on this map just because cannabis was grown here and cannabis was consumed here. Cannabis was grown here and it was proliferated throughout the entire nation. And so that brought the hype back to us, especially in Humboldt, where we have Cal Poly and things that would be ancillarily, information highway through colleges and things like that. I'm just wondering, how do we document that transcendence of basically the hustle, and how that the hustle hype has, and the marketing now that we have, which wasn't marketing before, it was just street hype. How do we translate that into a documentation in a way that still protects the people that are admitting that they've been hustling for 25 years, but still actually showing that these cultivations and mutations and hybrids were brought upon the entire hustle cycle as you know, a secular thing that we've all engaged.
I think it's a great question. And to be honest with you, I really think like it's going to be the collection of multiple oral histories of people talking about that experience, right? And so you're going to have to be able to document, like in the sense of like how it was then, and then talk to people like how it changed over time, right? And so in the sense of that, if we think about, you know, there was no such thing as social media, right? I mean, think about just the change of social media, right? And what that had to do with cannabis, right?
Right.
And so I really think one of the ways, at least for this project, would be through oral history. But also what you're talking about is a lot further documentation, right? Of looking at, you know, like you used to have like your information networks, which went from word of mouth to publications such as High Times to now blogs that are worldwide, right? You know, that like we used to have people who were famous because they did something. Now we have influencers who, like, my kids talk to me like, oh, this person's so famous. I have no idea who the hell they are. I said, who? Right? Like, so again, I mean, what you're talking about, I mean, that's also like an additional scope of research, but we can start scratching the surface of that, I think, through oral histories, as well as even through like the ethnographic interviews as well, in some respects that, you know, that Dominic is conducting.
Because in my forum, if I may just add to it for one moment, is the reason that I preserved or created crop tops was because the New York Sour Diesel was a seller at the time, you know, and it wasn't just a local seller, but it was like a national seller, you know, and so, and these, you know, big hustlers that would come to our doorsteps and things that were built pretty much the illicit market that became the medical, that became recreational, and all these types of things. We're preserving genetics based on the hustle, and that hustle isn't necessarily endemic to where we're preserving them at. And so there's like a cause and effect on why we preserve these genetics, or why we've hybridized them, or even self-feminized them using chemical hormones. Like each of them has an effect, because some of these hybrids that we've preserved are now chemical derivatives because of synthesized auxins from self-feminization. So they're not even the same, you know, chemical derivative, even though they may have the same genome alleles. And but the terpene profile, and all of us that have been on the streets forever, we can tell that that is a different form of what, you know, that's not the original SFB. We know that's not the original SFB, but you don't know it unless you've smelt it. So I was just kind of trying to brainstorm on how can we still protect everybody that's, you know, saying these stories, from pretty much embarking on saying, yeah, I've worked in the illicit market, but still say why it is and the truth of why these genetics have been preserved. Because we got an Arizona hustler over here that wants all the SFB. Okay, we preserve that one. We got a New York hustler that wants the NYC, so we go off with the green zones. The LA hustler wants green shock, so we preserve that. And that is all in an admittance of an extremely illicit market. So I was just curious on how we would get that truth out of the hustlers and the, you know, cultivators, without having to completely put themselves in a publicly known prohibited area. So thank you.
Yeah, and Nancy, I mean, you bring up a great point too in thinking about in the oral histories, right? That at one point or another, right, like those we'll be interviewing, we're breaking the law. But what I would also point out is that in oral history, I mean, the statute of limitations of actually growing cannabis in the illicit market has well passed in the sense for oral histories. I don't believe that, you know, again, anybody's going to come out, oh, you were growing cannabis back, you know, in the 1980s, that you were breaking, you know, these laws. But it's a great question though on that. And that's where, like, you know, in that pre-interview stage when we're discussing, right, those were also where I would hear stories and say, you know, you may not act, you may want to talk about that in like third party reference kind of things, right? And not fully commit yourself. And that's largely, which I've questioned in other interviews before, of committing felonies, right? And so there's a lot of difference of growing cannabis or like breaking the law in a serious manner, where I would usually caution interviewees to be a little more cautious if they really want to tell that story and how they want to do that. Any other questions? Did I put you all to sleep on a Friday afternoon before we went to the holidays?
No way, you're great.
Todd, are you familiar with a little bit of the backstory in regard to headband, or the moniker of headband as it's applied through across?
No.
Okay. Yeah, that might be a bit of a wormhole. So headband as a name has been applied like across the board to cultivars that have no relationship to each other. And it's through, I guess, market forces in a lot of instances on when or how that name would be applied. And I'm wondering how you would go about navigating collecting those different stories of those different headbands, and how that might help to clarify what is more deserving of the name headband, or what is clearly a rename, and what we would apply to it now that we have some documented history to make it more obvious, I guess.
Right. Well, in two different ways, right? And so one of the things which I always love, because people talk about, like, when it comes to oral history, I say, well, what if so and so just says whatever, right? Right, which happens. And the difference between hearsay and history is that history is able to be verified. And so thinking of headband as your example, that's something that we can have multiple people talk on, right? For one. And so you're going to be able to, like, through those coming along can be able to say, hey, listen, you had these 5 people who were saying this same kind of thing that kind of adds up about headband. These people over here, it seems kind of odd, right? And that's also something that we would also discuss in the oral histories prior to recording. Like, hey, we need to actually discuss in some of these cultivars when the name game started, particularly with medical and afterwards, right? What are the cultivars being used, right? What are not? What we also are able to do in this project, and this is where Eleanor and her team at LeafWorks comes along, is to be able to say, hey, the genetics, right, and the herbarium tell us this about these cultivars. And so that's what's so exciting to be part of an amazing team like this, is because just operating by myself, there's only so much I could do. But being able to bring those together, right? Dominic's ethnographies of talking about when genetics actually came into California and the different stories of that and how they moved, right, between communities. My oral history is giving a little more detail on that, right? From the community standpoints, and then Eleanor's work being able to say, actually, the science says this, right? From what we know. That triangulation, that to me is like, it's like a person, like the most perfect recipe you can get to start actually really laying a good foundation.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really powerful tool, Eleanor's contribution to that, because I guess in the case of headband, she would be able to have that record in the herbarium where you guys would be able to go back and pull data from it to delineate, like, what is the LA Kush headband, what's the Loompas headband. And I guess, yeah, I'm interested in how all that will go forward after being put into historical record.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, that's also one of the great things, like when you conduct oral histories, there's ways that I use the oral histories, but then it's also a resource for everyone else to come and use, right? And so it's going to be there for communities. It's going to be there for other scholars to come and say, listen, I'm going to go deep. Say, with your example, I'm going deep on headband. And I'm going to really trace this thing out all the way down to the end of the word, like till we come to the end of that tunnel, right? And that's where, again, so it's one of the things where it's a service too of building that foundation for others to also use years after I moved on to other projects or retired or something like that, right? So
Yeah. I guess
awesome.
another good example of a cultivar that would have multiple iterations would be Catpis, coming from the East Bay out here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Scott. No, really important question. Sam, you're on mute, brother.
I saw that. I was just going to build off that a bit and say that, yeah, no, that's a really great question, Scott, and a really great example. You know, it's like, I was just thinking of that with the Berry White for an example. It's a newer cross, but it's like, I've seen so many different, name changes and variations. I remember specifically a scenario, where someone allegedly had changed the name from, because Berry White was just played out and not selling, and they just took that same genetic and changed the name to be White Walker, for an example, because Game of Thrones was big at the time. And it's like these different scenarios that, like, how do you know what I mean, like, document and specify that? And I think that's where it's the overlapping studies that create that framework that starts to kind of weave the web and interconnect the stories, this hearsay, the histories, the actual, like, tracing of those landrace genetics that went into those things, the White Widow, the, you know what I mean, like, the blueberry or whatever, ended up being the core pillars of the Berry White, or the sour diesel, same way. You know what I mean? You got your New York sour, you got your, so many different variations of sour that I've seen over the years. It's insane. And it's very difficult to find the, like, original NY sour, right? I don't even know if anybody has the original anymore. I mean, I'm sure a couple people do. But it's just, it's so interesting and fascinating stuff. So I just wanted to kind of convey that. And also, yeah, same, I think that's, theoretically, it's the overlap of the studies, right, Todd, and the bringing of the puzzle pieces together, so to speak. But I'd love to hear your take on on that, and how, like, the oral history is compiled with the ethnographic research and the political geography and the genetics kind of bring it together, like, puzzle.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the great things, so as a history nerd, right, like with 7 kids, so like my kids talk all the time about, like, they honestly think, like, well, cannabis was always like that, right? And it's like, no, man. Like, I remember, like, in the 80s waiting in some dark parking lot for somebody, and, like, then all of a sudden to get stuff, and it's like there was no name attached to these, right? And so this is where I think really documenting, like, and Dominic's work, as well as the oral histories, of really being able to bring those together, first of all, to lay that type of foundation. Like, when did we, like the early growers, so the elders in these communities, to be able to talk about, like, this is where these seeds were coming from, right? These were the cultivars that we were using, and this is what we called them, right? That's a very basis before now that we've been, over the last, 20 years or more, almost, like, of, like, what we've gotten into this kind of thing of this name game. All of a sudden we're calling stuff that, right? Which really wasn't there, at least among the consuming public who wasn't growing anything like myself, right? Like it was like, oh, that's green, that works. Right. Right. And so you just had maybe different street names for that represented what the quality was. And so these are really beginning to, like, actually document what the cultivars were, which only the breeders and the growers would actually know, and the community would actually discuss them, what they identified that. And then to also then begin with these various interviews, both ethnographic and oral history, to see how they begin to change, right? Like, how did this change over time? And there might be, and then we add the science onto that. But I just look at that as really as a great historical reminder to the young generation today, right, of how it was. I almost feel like my grandparents, like, back in my day, right? But again, that's the only time that if we to capture these type of interviews now, right, to begin to document that backstory. right? And that's how we're going to really begin to unravel some of these riddles about names, right? And get people, from all over California, from their experience and their expertise to actually begin to tell their side of the story or begin to unravel what these names actually meant, right? And in a sense of how the commodification of this with the medical market began that name game, right? And what was true and what was not, right? And then yes, so we are able to document that some, and then Eleanor gets to come in with the hard science and say, well, the science says this, right? Which if you ever have friends who are scientists, they're always like undercutting every assumption you have. Well, the science actually says this, right? So again, it's just really a privilege to have this kind of triangulation. As one who's been in academia for a long time, it's actually rather rare. AC.
I was just gonna add that just as a society of cannabis community, we just have to really emotionally detach from what we know as fact. Like I know a lot of people will argue things down as like science opposed to science, but we have to realize that like a human is 5 different people depending on the scenario that they're put in. And cannabis plants they're the same. I could have the same geno alleles that we could go through Eleanor and we can create an entire DNA map of a cultivar and match it up. But those DNA marks are only matchable by what somebody else said something was. So it's only a database of what has been collected. It's not an absolute of what exists. And so we're like every single DNA place that I've worked with is triangulating this map of base strains to heirloom or landrace strains, and then adaptable landrace strains, and then proliferated out to hybrids. And we just need to not be emotionally attached to the fact that, yeah, we can have a diesel grown indoor in New York. It doesn't look or smell anything like the one that we're growing in the Emerald Triangle, but it has the same DNA structure. And so you're going to go back and forth and arguing like, I own this, I have some IP rights, nobody's got any IP on it, but it's going to be that sort of emotional debate in society for a minute as we work out. The fact is that it is expressing a different thing or different elements and different practices and different fertilizers and all these different elements. So we just really have to ask society to not take this cultivar and name game too seriously, because there will be brawls. Some of my breeders and the hustlers are so passionately intense about like claiming things. And so we just have to accept that plants are malleable. They're going to be changing just like all of us. So that's what I just wanted to add that to society.
No, thank you so much. You're so spot on. I mean, in a lot of those, right? We don't like cannabis can't benefit from, apple growers back in like New York and other places in the US. We're actually hand drawing what their apples look like. And it's like, okay, for over 150 years, we've called it this, and it looks like this, right? Right. We don't have the benefit of that. And so you're really spot on in that regards, that it's going to take a collective effort altogether to kind of unweave and unravel some of this. So thank you so much for that. Janine, I think we're at time. Any last questions? Well, I'd like to say happy holidays and thank you all.
Thank you, Todd. Awesome. We could listen to you all day, man. Really appreciate it. And
For real.
such an honor to work with you. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Guys
Thanks everyone for joining us.
I've never enjoyed a history lesson so much. No, I'm just kidding. Discussion on oral history.
Thanks, everybody. Super exciting.
Thanks all. Take care. We'll see you in the new year.
Thanks a lot. Have a great day.